In the vast heart of the Sahel, where dust storms darken the horizon and rains vanish without warning, Ibrahim Traoré made a declaration few could believe: 15 million banana trees. To the outside world, it sounded absurd. Bananas in the desert? But to his people, it felt like defiance, a stand against hunger and humiliation. Was this a reckless gamble meant to stir applause, or the seed of a new African destiny? Today, we'll journey into the story of this so-called banana revolution. If you believe Africa can take control of its own future, type Africa in the comments. Your voice helps carry this story further. And don't forget to subscribe so you can walk with us on this path toward a stronger, sovereign Africa. For decades, Burkina Faso carried the weight of fragility on its shoulders. The nation's lifeline rested on two pillars: cotton and gold. Cotton was tied to foreign subsidies and global fashion markets. Gold, though glittering in mines beneath Burkina's soil, too often flowed outward into multinational accounts or into the pockets of the few. For ordinary families, these riches rarely translated into food on the table or stability in life. Hunger still stalked the countryside. Droughts left villages gasping for water. And sovereignty, true independence, felt less like reality and more like a slogan borrowed from history books. This was the backdrop against which a young leader emerged, unwilling to accept dependency as destiny. President Ibrahim Traoré, barely in his 30s, took the stage before a skeptical parliament. The cameras rolled, his words carried across the airwaves, and what he said sounded less like conventional policy and more like a dare to the impossible. Burkina Faso would plant 15 million banana trees. No feasibility study stamped with foreign approval. No waiting on loans from international lenders. No clearance from development agencies. Just a clear command. The desert would no longer dictate what the nation could or could not grow. The reaction was swift and merciless. Foreign newspapers branded the announcement the fantasy of a dreamer. Diplomats whispered that Traoré was gambling with the survival of his people. Economists lined up on talk shows, pointing to scarce water, fragile infrastructure, and market risks, warning of certain collapse. In global capitals, the idea was filed away as yet another example of reckless populism from an African president looking for applause at home. Yet inside Burkina Faso, the response carried an entirely different tone. For generations, citizens had been told what they could not do. They could not resist the desert. They could not feed themselves without aid. They could not prosper without handouts. And suddenly a leader stood before them, refusing to repeat that script. His decree was bold, even outrageous, but it was also electrifying. He was no longer speaking of limits. He was speaking of possibility. For once, sovereignty was not just about flags or national anthems. It was about soil, food, and survival. Why bananas? On the surface, the choice seemed bizarre, but Traoré's reasoning was both pragmatic and symbolic. Bananas grow fast, fruiting within a year, far quicker than cotton cycles. Unlike gold, bananas could be eaten, traded, and stored. They created food security first, before exports. Every part of the plant had value: fruit for families and markets, leaves and trunks as animal feed, chips and flour for cooperatives. In one stroke, the banana was both nourishment and opportunity. But beyond the practical benefits, bananas offered something more profound. Planted in clusters, their broad leaves shade the ground, slow erosion, and trap precious moisture. In a land fighting desertification, they were not just crops, they were shields. Each grove was like a fortress standing against the advancing sands. To Traoré, every leaf was a soldier's shield, every bunch of fruit a ration for the battle ahead. The symbolism became impossible to ignore. In a televised address, he thundered, "Every tree we plant is a declaration of independence." He vowed Burkina Faso would no longer beg for bread while its land had the power to produce fruit. He promised that no longer would livestock depend on expensive imported feed when local trunks could sustain them. And most of all, he swore that dignity would never again be outsourced to foreign corporations. For the people, these words struck like lightning. Suddenly, sovereignty wasn't an abstract slogan. It was a tree they could plant, water, and defend. It was food on their plates, jobs in their villages, and hope in their children's eyes. Outside the country, confusion reigned. Donor agencies scoffed, saying the plan lacked scientific rigor. Corporate voices in established banana markets, like Côte d'Ivoire's coastal exporters, grumbled about looming competition. To them, Traoré was breaking the unwritten rules. Landlocked countries were supposed to stay dependent, not rise as rivals. But at home, skepticism only fueled determination. In villages across Burkina Faso, farmers began to speak of planting as an act of resistance. The youth saw in orchards not just food, but employment and dignity. Women envisioned new cooperatives where they could lead production, process fruit, and claim decision-making power. The banana campaign was no longer only agriculture, it was a revolution with roots. Of course, the criticisms did not disappear. Experts repeated their mantra: bananas cannot grow in the desert. But Traoré was not naive. He knew some seedlings would die, he knew storms would tear through fields, pests would strike, and failures would mount. Yet he also understood something his critics overlooked: that sovereignty is not built on perfection, but on persistence. The gamble was not whether every plant would survive, but whether a nation could endure setbacks without surrendering its dignity. So the digging began. Families carved holes in dry soil, children carried water in small buckets, soldiers transported seedlings along dusty roads, elders prayed over fields, blessing the land with chants of resilience. What had been desert now became battlefield. What had been dismissed as impossible now became a daily mission of survival and pride. The skeptics watched, waiting for collapse. But inside Burkina Faso, something deeper was sprouting. The desert was still there. The odds were still brutal. Yet with every tree pushed into the ground, citizens began to believe that perhaps the future was not written in sand, but in the roots they themselves planted. Do you think planting bananas in the desert was madness or vision? Drop your thoughts in the comments. When Ibrahim Traoré announced his plan, it was not left to sit on paper. He mobilized the country with the precision of a military campaign. Every sector, every citizen was drawn into the mission. Planting bananas was no longer a project. It became a duty that stretched from villages to the capital, woven into daily life. The first recruits were children. Schools across Burkina Faso turned classrooms into small nurseries. Teachers taught not only math and history, but also the science of soil, light, and growth. Seedlings lined the edges of chalkboards, and watering schedules became part of homework. For the young, each sprouting leaf was more than biology. It was patriotism in a pot. In their hands, the banana became a symbol of future sovereignty. The army followed next. Once defined by its fight against insurgencies, the military found itself reassigned to another front: defense against the desert. Trucks that had once carried rifles now transported saplings. Soldiers dug irrigation trenches with the same discipline used to build fortifications. Their uniforms, once stained with dust from combat, became covered in soil from banana fields. For villagers, the sight of soldiers planting trees was nothing short of astonishing. It carried a powerful message. The state was not only there to protect them from enemies, but also to cultivate their survival. Women too found themselves at the center of this revolution. Long excluded from decisions at the highest level, they began organizing cooperatives in towns and villages. Training programs taught them how to cultivate, slice, dry, and preserve bananas. They learned to turn fruit into chips for markets, flour for porridge, and snacks for schools. What had once been considered men's work, large-scale farming, was now a shared responsibility. For women, the banana was more than food. It was a tool of empowerment, a way to gain economic independence and community leadership. Even the airwaves carried the campaign forward. Radios across the nation filled with new songs urging citizens to plant for freedom, plant for tomorrow. Jingles replaced advertisements, embedding the campaign in the rhythm of daily life. Musicians composed ballads about orchards. Children sang choruses about sovereignty sprouting from the soil. Everywhere the message was the same. Planting bananas was not just cultivation, it was resistance, resilience, and hope. Traoré gave the effort a name: the Banana Army. Each tree is a soldier, he declared. 15 million soldiers would march across the savannah, not with rifles, but with roots. The metaphor resonated deeply. For a people long used to sending their sons into battle, the idea that families could now join a different kind of front, armed with seedlings, water, and determination, was transformative. Planting season became a campaign of national defense, but the war was harsh. The Sahel sun showed no mercy. One week brought too much rain, the next brought none at all. Termites chewed through young trunks. Goats wandered into fields, trampling seedlings. Fierce winds snapped fragile stems. Within weeks, photographs of withered plants began to circulate. International media seized on the images. Headlines declared the project a failure, with analysts saying smugly, "We told you, bananas cannot grow in the desert." In that moment of embarrassment, Traoré acted. He traveled to the hardest-hit areas, stood beside farmers staring at dead plants, and pulled a lifeless stem from the soil. Holding it aloft, he spoke with blunt resolve. "This one is gone, but another will stand." Sovereignty does not sprout in one season. It grows with persistence. The scene, broadcast nationwide, transformed a moment of despair into a lesson in resilience. What outsiders called defeat, citizens began to see as training. Science followed rhetoric. Agronomists introduced drought-resistant banana varieties, adapted from East African strains designed for harsher climates. Engineers piloted solar-powered drip irrigation systems, delivering water straight to roots while conserving every drop. Farmers revived traditional techniques such as Z-pits, circular holes designed to trap and hold rainwater, repurposed for banana seedlings. Each setback sparked innovation. Each problem became a new opportunity to adapt. Communities organized themselves with remarkable discipline. Women created early morning watering shifts, carrying buckets at dawn before the heat became unbearable. Youth brigades patrolled fields to guard against livestock, repairing fences and protecting saplings. Soldiers, once trained to defend borders, now defended irrigation pumps and dug channels to redirect scarce rainfall. Food production, once routine labor, became an act of national defense. Slowly, green began to return to the landscape. Survival rates improved. Villages that had once watched fields shrivel now saw rows of banana plants stretching across the savannah. Brown earth gave way to patches of green. Farmers who had long stared at barren soil now looked at flourishing leaves with pride. The desert, once thought invincible, was no longer unchallenged. The change was more than physical, it was psychological. Planting was no longer seen as drudgery, but as a patriotic ritual. Communities held ceremonies to bless seedlings before planting. Children carried songs home from schools to families. Farmers spoke of their fields with new dignity, calling them front lines against hunger. The banana army was no longer a metaphor, it was a living movement of people, trees, and hope. And then came the question that echoed across the nation. If the world insists bananas cannot grow in the desert, who will prove them wrong if not us? That spirit carried the campaign forward through setbacks and through victories, through drought and through rain. Would you have joined Traoré's banana army if you were there? If you believe in this fight, say Traoré in the comments. The first signs of change appeared not in export reports or government ledgers, but in the villages themselves. Farmers began to see each banana tree as more than a plant. It became a kind of savings account rooted in the soil. A thickening stem was no longer just greenery, it was security. When it fruited, it meant food for children, cash for the market, and a future that no foreign company could seize. One farmer in the Sahel put it simply, "This tree is my bank. It will never betray me like the markets of cotton and gold." Local markets transformed almost overnight. Where fresh bananas had once been a rare luxury imported from coastal neighbors, now baskets overflowed with fruit from Burkina Faso orchards. Families that used to stretch to afford them could now buy bunches at prices within reach. Women ground dried bananas into flour for porridge and bread, while school lunch programs added banana chips as a daily staple. Bakeries experimented with cakes, porridges, and breads using local banana flour, reducing dependence on imported wheat. Food that had once been foreign and expensive was now homegrown, familiar, and affordable. The changes reached livestock pens as well. What the world dismissed as waste, banana stalks and leaves, became a hidden treasure. Farmers shredded them for feed, and soon the difference was clear. Chickens fattened faster, laying more eggs. Goats grew sturdier, producing richer milk. Cattle gained weight, delivering more meat for the market. Feed costs, which had drained family budgets, dropped dramatically. For the first time, raising animals was not a burden but a real source of profit. Markets that once lacked eggs, milk, and meat now buzzed with supply. Nutrition levels climbed, especially for children, and rural households that had once struggled for survival began to taste abundance. This abundance fueled a new cycle of reinvestment. Cooperatives pooled profits not just to grow more crops, but to build infrastructure that aid agencies had promised for years, but rarely delivered. Wells were dug with local money, ensuring water security for both people and fields. Schools added classrooms funded by banana sales. Clinics stocked with medicine and powered by solar panels sprang up, financed by cooperative savings. Dirt paths became paved roads built not by foreign contractors, but by village contributions. For once, progress arrived not as a donor's gift, but as the fruit of the people's own labor. At the center of this new economy stood women. As heads of cooperatives, they managed accounts, signed contracts, and made decisions once reserved for men. Mothers who had long waited for permission to spend money now became treasurers, managers, and negotiators. They chose how to invest profits, whether in wells, schools, or storage facilities. For many, it was the first taste of leadership and autonomy. "Before we waited," one cooperative leader explained. "Now we decide." With bananas, empowerment was not a slogan, but a lived experience. Then came the leap from domestic sufficiency to global commerce. The first containers of bananas left Burkina Faso for Dubai, their boxes stamped proudly with the label, "Bananas of the Sahel." At first, buyers were skeptical. Could fruit grown in the desert compete with the smooth bananas of Côte d'Ivoire or the mass shipments from Costa Rica? But once displayed in Gulf supermarkets, the answer became clear. The fruit was firm, sweet, and exotic. Demand grew. Soon, shipments expanded to Europe, marketed as desert bananas, their story as appealing as their taste. What had begun as survival was turning into trade. The revenues surprised even the skeptics. Within a decade, banana exports rivaled cotton in foreign exchange earnings. Unlike gold, which enriched multinationals, banana profits stayed in-country, divided between state reserves and cooperative savings. Cotton, long the backbone of the economy, was overtaken by a fruit once mocked as impossible. Even gold, Burkina Faso's most valuable resource, faced competition from orchards tended in every village. For a people long excluded from their own wealth, this was a revolution. Symbolism deepened as results grew. What outsiders had ridiculed as the folly of a dreamer turned into a weapon of sovereignty. Bananas were no longer just food or commerce, they were a manifesto. They proved that dignity could sprout from soil others had dismissed. They showed that sovereignty was not only about borders and flags, but about the power to feed oneself, trade on one's own terms, and reinvest in one's own future. The banana had become more than a crop. It was now a declaration of independence with roots, leaves, and fruit. Is this truly Africa rewriting the rules of sovereignty, or just another gamble waiting to collapse? If you believe it's real, type yes in the comments. As the banana grove spread across Burkina Faso's savannah, the ripple effects began to move beyond its borders. In neighboring Mali and Niger, where desertification gnawed just as fiercely, delegations were dispatched to see the experiment firsthand. Officials returned with reports of shaded orchards, healthier soil, and livestock feeding on banana stalks instead of costly imports. Farmers, hearing the news, pressed their leaders to copy the model. The phrase banana belt began to circulate in policy circles, a vision of a green corridor cutting across the Sahel, uniting countries long divided by drought and dependency. Morocco, with its own history of agricultural innovation, stepped in with technical support. Engineers in Rabat collaborated on irrigation systems suited to arid climates, while universities shared research on soil management. What had started as a bold gamble in a landlocked nation began to evolve into a regional strategy. But outside Africa, the reactions were far more conflicted. In the Gulf states, supermarkets welcomed shipments labeled "Bananas of the Sahel." Consumers found the fruit surprisingly firm and sweet. Investors saw profitable trade routes, and governments enjoyed the symbolism of supporting African resilience. Yet behind the smiles lurked unease. Food has always been political, and dependence on Burkina Faso for a staple crop flipped a familiar dynamic. For decades, Africa had depended on Gulf food imports. Now, wealthy Gulf nations were becoming dependent on African suppliers. It was a subtle but profound shift in leverage, one that unsettled capitals accustomed to holding the upper hand. In Europe, resistance hardened quickly. Agricultural lobbies in France and Spain, fearing competition with cheaper Sahelian fruit, pressured Brussels to take action. Calls for tariffs and safeguard measures echoed through the halls of the European Union. Officials cloaked their arguments in the language of quality standards and sustainability, but the fear was plain, that a landlocked African nation had managed to outflank established producers in Côte d'Ivoire, Ecuador, and Central America. For European farmers, the desert bananas represented not just competition, but humiliation, a reminder that innovation no longer flowed only from the north. Even more telling was the sudden pivot of the same international banks and agencies that had mocked the plan in its infancy. Reports that once dismissed the project as reckless now praised it as a model of climate-smart agriculture. Glossy brochures from development institutions highlighted how banana groves provided food, feed, and exports all at once. But woven into this praise was something else, an attempt to claim credit. Analysts hinted that without technical support from international experts, the project might not have succeeded. It was a subtle rewriting of history meant to fold Burkina Faso's achievement back into the larger narrative of global development, a narrative where Africa survives because of donor benevolence. Traoré would have none of it. In a fiery speech, he reminded the world, "We planted with our hands, not with their money." His words echoed across Ouagadougou and deep into the villages, cutting through the polished reports and carefully staged conferences abroad. By reclaiming credit, he stripped away one of the aid industry's most prized illusions, that progress in Africa could never happen without outside guidance. In Washington, unease turned into alarm. Think tanks began circulating reports warning that Burkina Faso's experiment posed a dangerous precedent. If one small, resource-poor country could defy the aid system and still succeed, others might follow. Analyst Armbadis described it as a contagion, not of disease, but of ideas. The sovereignty-first model, if it spread, could sideline the IMF and World Bank, undermine decades of dependency structures, and weaken Western leverage across the continent. The concern was no longer about bananas, it was about control of the narrative. For years, Africa's story had been told in terms of fragility, failure, and reliance. Now Burkina Faso was writing a chapter of defiance. Western media, too, struggled to adjust. In the early days, headlines mocked the project as populist theatre. Commentators lumped it with vanity schemes often used to caricature African leadership. But as orchards matured, exports grew, and hunger rates fell, the tone shifted. Commentaries began to ask uneasy questions. If sovereignty could sprout in the desert, what did that mean for the global order? Could food, not gold or oil, become the real weapon of African independence? The clash of perspectives was stark. Critics in the West still warned of risks: climate volatility, fragile infrastructure, market fluctuations. Supporters pointed to data: reduced malnutrition, rising exports, empowered cooperatives, and proof that resilience, not perfection, was the real triumph. The debate spilled into universities, policy papers, and television panels. Some painted the experiment as a fragile illusion. Others hailed it as the start of a development model that could liberate nations from the chokehold of aid. For Burkina Faso, the scrutiny mattered little. What counted was the reality on the ground: fruit in markets, feed for livestock, and dignity in the villages. The Banana Belt was no longer a fantasy, it was a living idea, one that threatened to redraw the political and economic map of the Sahel. Can food be a stronger weapon than gold? Tell us below. What began as a gamble, 15 million banana trees planted in defiance of the desert, has grown into a story that reaches far beyond Burkina Faso. For a nation once defined by scarcity and dependency, bananas became more than fruit. They became symbols of dignity, resilience, and sovereignty. Families learned to see their orchards as savings accounts. Women stepped into positions of leadership, managing cooperatives and shaping community futures. Villages reinvested profits into schools, wells, and clinics without waiting for outside charity. Livestock thrived on stalks and leaves once dismissed as waste. And across the savannah, children no longer sang about despair, but about orchards standing against the sands. Yet the meaning of this story is larger than one crop or one country. The bananas of the Sahel became exports that rivaled cotton and even gold. More importantly, they challenged a long-standing script that Africa must forever depend on aid dictated by donors and managed from abroad. By planting trees in the dust, Burkina Faso planted a new idea: that sovereignty can be cultivated, harvested, and shared. Still, questions linger. Can these orchards withstand the harsh cycles of climate change? Can they survive global market fluctuations or political sabotage from those who fear Africa's independence? Or will this be remembered as a fragile experiment, a bold but fleeting victory against the desert? The answers remain uncertain, but one truth is clear. Burkina Faso has shown that resilience is not born from waiting, but from planting. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson. Sovereignty is not given, it is grown. Sometimes it sprouts from soil others call barren. Sometimes it begins with an idea that outsiders laugh at. And sometimes it takes the shape of a fruit, green and golden, carrying with it the taste of independence. What does it all mean to you? Drop your thoughts below. Your voice matters here. And if this story moved you, hit subscribe and stay with us for more.